On the 7th day of the battle, the ravens arrived. They came in flocks, settling on 400 German bodies that had been baking in the Mediterranean sun since the afternoon of the 20th of May, 1941. The flies had come first, then the birds, and then something else, a smell so overwhelming that the Australian soldiers manning their positions on the hills above Rethymno had stopped noticing it. The way a man stops noticing the sound of a river when he has lived beside one long enough. The paratroopers of the German 11th Air Corps, the most celebrated soldiers in the most powerful military machine in human history, had fallen from the sky like hailstones and lay where they landed. More than 400 of them. And the men who had shot them down were still in their trenches, still holding their ground, still denying the Germans the one thing they had come to take. Their commanding colonel was in an Australian prisoner of war compound 600 meters away. Before you hear how that happened, drop a comment below telling me whether you have ever heard of the Battle of Rethymno, because I suspect the answer for most of you is no, and that silence is itself the story. Watch until the very end, because what you are about to learn has been sitting in classified archives and forgotten journals for more than 80 years, and when it is finished, you will understand something about the Second World War that the official histories have never quite managed to say out loud. Forget everything you think you know about airborne warfare. What happened on this island in 9 days destroyed one empire's greatest weapon and handed that same weapon to the men who would use it to liberate the world. Are you ready for the truth that the history books buried? Then stay right here, because we are only just getting started. Let us begin. To understand what happened on a rocky Greek island in the spring of 1941, one must first understand the man who believed he had invented the future of warfare itself. His name was Kurt Student, and he was a man in love with an idea. He had been a fighter pilot in the Great War, a man who had spent 4 years looking down at the battlefield from above, watching infantry crawl through mud at the cost of 100,000 lives for a kilometer of ground. And he had arrived at a conclusion that seemed so obvious he could not understand why no one else had acted on it. The problem with armies was that they moved on the ground. The solution was to put them in the air. Student spent the 1930s building his vision from the foundations up, first in secret, as the Nazi regime quietly rebuilt the air force it had been forbidden to possess, then openly, with the full backing of Hermann Göring and Adolf Hitler himself. Hitler had been intoxicated by the concept from the moment he heard it. He told one of his senior commanders with barely contained excitement that this was how the war of the future would be fought, the sky black with bombers, and from them, leaping into the smoke, the parachuting stormtroopers, each man grasping a submachine gun. The Fallschirmjäger, the sky hunters, were Hitler's personal obsession and Student's life's work. They were to be the weapon that made all other weapons obsolete. Student was given everything he asked for. The training regime he built was ferocious and deliberately exclusionary. Only volunteers were accepted, and the selection process was designed to eliminate anyone who was not exceptional. Candidates trained for 3 months in live-fire infantry tactics, field medicine, camouflage, terrain navigation, and the specific physical demands of jumping from a moving aircraft at low altitude. Most men who attempted the course did not complete it. Those who did were issued their distinctive rimless helmet and their jump smock, and they became the Fallschirmjäger, veterans of campaigns in Norway, Holland, Belgium, and Yugoslavia, by the time the spring of 1941 arrived. Their average age was under 20. They were everything Student had promised Hitler they would be. They had one weakness. It was built into the parachute itself. The German RZ-16 parachute used a static line system that attached automatically to the aircraft as the soldier jumped, yanking the canopy open as he fell. The mechanism was prone to fouling if any piece of equipment caught on the line, which meant every Fallschirmjäger was required to wear a one-piece coverall over his entire kit before he boarded the plane. The consequence of this was operational and absolute. A German paratrooper stepped out of a Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft carrying a pistol, 4 grenades, a field dressing, and a water canteen. His rifle, his ammunition, his machine gun, everything that made him lethal, was packed into separate weapons containers and dropped from the aircraft's external bomb racks. He had to land, locate his container, and retrieve his weapons before he could fight effectively. In training exercises against unprepared or simulated defenders, this gap lasted seconds. Against men who had been waiting in camouflaged positions for 3 weeks and who understood exactly what was coming, it was a death sentence. Doctrine required jumps from no higher than 400 feet, lower than the roof of many city office buildings, to minimize the time soldiers spent drifting in the open air. The aircraft carrying them had to fly straight, level, and slow to ensure accurate drops. This was not a flaw in students' thinking. It had never needed to be. The Fallschirmjäger had always landed on targets that were surprised, disorganized, or lightly defended. Speed and shock had rendered the weapons container problem irrelevant. No one had ever been waiting for them with loaded guns and 18 months of North African combat experience. That was about to change. The island of Crete sits at the southern edge of the Aegean Sea, like a shield thrown down between Greece and North Africa. 400 kilometers of mountains and rocky coastline that had been contested by every empire that had ever controlled the Mediterranean. In the spring of 1941, it was the last piece of ground the British Empire still held in the eastern Mediterranean, and it mattered to both sides with an urgency that bordered on desperation. For the Germans, Crete provided air bases within striking distance of the Ploesti oil fields in Romania, the single most important fuel source for Hitler's war machine. For the British, it was the last foothold, the final line before the eastern Mediterranean fell entirely under Axis control and the war in North Africa became unwinnable. Students' plan, codenamed Operation Mercury, was the most audacious thing the German military had ever attempted. 22,000 men, 500 Junkers, Ju-52 transports, 330 bombers, and 180 fighters. 4 simultaneous airborne assaults on the island's 3 airfields, Malium in the west, Heraklion in the east, and a small landing strip 8 kilometers east of the coastal town of Rethymno in the center. Once the airfields were seized, mountain troops and armor could be flown directly in from Greece. The entire island would fall within 48 hours. Student was so confident in the timeline that his planning staff had treated the logistics as an administrative exercise rather than a combat operation. The German intelligence picture underpinned all of this confidence. The Abwehr reported that the total Allied force on Crete consisted of approximately 5,000 men. Their specific assessment of the central airfield at Rethymno was 4 words long, not formally garrisoned. Whether Abwehr Chief Admiral Canaris, who would later be executed by the Nazis for allegedly plotting against Hitler, was genuinely misinformed or quietly sabotaging the operation was never established. What is certain is that the report was wrong in every particular that mattered. The position at Rethymno was occupied by 1,270 combat veterans who had spent the previous 3 months fighting their way across 2 countries. The Australian soldiers of the 2nd 19th Brigade had not arrived on Crete by design. They had arrived because they had run out of mainland Greece to defend. Ian Ross Campbell had climbed Mount Everest. He had won the Sword of Honor at the Royal Military College Duntroon on graduation in 1922. He had crawled through enemy wire in the darkness outside Bardia in December of 1940, personally mapping the assault routes that allowed the 16th Brigade to capture an Italian fortress considered impregnable. And he had been decorated for conspicuous gallantry in the doing of it. He was 41 years old, born in Moss Vale in New South Wales, and he had held temporary command of the force, defending Rethymno for exactly 6 weeks when the German transport planes began assembling on Greek airfields to the north. In 6 weeks, he had turned a collection of exhausted, under-equipped survivors of 2 campaigns into a coherent defensive force. He had done it without adequate supplies, without proper communications, and without the support of higher command, which was busy preparing for the seaborne invasion that would never arrive. His force was a product of catastrophe. The 2nd, 1st, and 2nd 11th Battalions had fought through Libya, then Greece, then the bitter rearguard actions at Porto Rafti as German panzers closed in on the evacuation beaches. When they boarded the ships, they were exhausted and under-equipped. What they received instead of rest was Crete and a new assignment. Hold the central airstrip at all costs. The veterans from New South Wales and Western Australia who filed off the ships at Rethymno carried the accumulated weight of 18 months of continuous combat. They had learned things that could not be taught in training, the particular discipline of men who had been in danger long enough to stop being frightened of it and start being efficient in it. What they had not brought from Greece was heavy equipment. Artillery pieces, armored vehicles, and spare weapons had been abandoned during the withdrawal. Campbell's 8 guns, 4 captured Italian 100mm pieces, and 4 75mm field guns represented a fraction of what doctrine required. The 2 Matilda II heavy tanks assigned to his force were temperamental machines that had already demonstrated a tendency to fail at the worst possible moments. His communications architecture consisted of 3 old Greek civilian telephones, 1 captured German field phone, and an assortment of runners on foot. The Greeks assigned to Campbell's command presented a different kind of problem. 2,300 men had been added to his force from the 4th and 5th Greek regiments, but many had received little or no military training. Many had no rifles, and for those who had, the ammunition supply averaged fewer than 20 rounds per man. Some soldiers had been issued only 3 rounds apiece. Campbell sent several of the most poorly equipped men home and organized the rest as best he could, placing the Greek gendarmerie, 800 well-armed police cadets who knew the town and its streets, in Rethymno itself to defend the civilian population and the port. They would prove to be among the most effective fighters in the entire engagement. Then Campbell put his men underground and covered them up. The 2nd 1st Battalion dug into Hill A, the eastern height overlooking the airstrip, with 6 of his 8 artillery pieces positioned to cover every approach from the sea. The 2nd 11th dug into Hill B, the western height, with the remaining 2 guns and the Vickers machine guns of the 1st Machine Gun Battalion. The Greek 4th Regiment occupied the ridge connecting the 2 hills. The Greek 5th was positioned to the south as a reserve. Campbell's headquarters sat on Hill D, a slightly lower feature with clear sight lines across the entire position. Every placement was camouflaged with fishing nets, requisitioned from the town, woven through with fresh wheat stalks from the surrounding fields. Gunner Lou Lind, with the 2nd 3rd Field Regiment, remembered the guns he helped conceal. At 30 yards distance, they were invisible, a feat of camouflage performed with unmistakable pride. The men had requisitioned the nets from local fishermen, working through the night to weave the wheat stalks into the mesh until each position looked from above like an unbroken patch of Cretan farmland. It was not sophisticated technology. It was patience and ingenuity and the kind of improvisation that men develop when they have been fighting with inadequate resources for long enough that improvisation becomes instinct. Campbell inspected each position personally and found himself satisfied. The Germans were flying into a trap that looked, from 400 feet, like an empty field. On the 19th of May, a lone German reconnaissance aircraft appeared over the position on what was clearly a photographic mission. A Bren gun crew acting against explicit standing orders not to reveal their positions, opened fire and brought it down. Campbell was furious. Then he examined the wreck. Inside the downed aircraft, he found two things that changed the character of the entire operation. The first was a German codebook. The second was a set of aerial photographs of his own defenses taken on previous passes. Campbell spread the photographs on a table and studied them with a mountain climber's attention to terrain. His best positions, the most critical guns and machine gun nests, were completely hidden by the camouflage. The wheat stalks woven through the fishing nets had matched the spectral signature of the surrounding fields, well enough to fool a camera from altitude. The Germans would drop into Rethymno on the 20th of May, without knowing where his strongest defenses were located. An act of insubordination by a Bren gun crew had handed Campbell the most valuable intelligence advantage of the entire battle. He quietly decided not to punish them. The codebook would serve a different purpose, one that the Luftwaffe pilots who would use it to deliver supplies the following week could not have imagined. What Campbell did not know, and would not know for days, was the broader picture forming to the west. The battle was to be fought on 4 sectors simultaneously, and the intelligence he possessed about Rethymno did not extend to Malem, 60 kilometers along the coast, where Student had concentrated his most powerful assault force. Freyberg, the New Zealand general commanding the entire island defense, had been warned explicitly by British intelligence, the kind of warning that should have changed every defensive deployment on the island. The British had broken the German Enigma cipher, and the ultra-intelligence intercepts reaching Freyberg's headquarters in early May had named Operation Mercury with operational specificity, identifying the target airfields, the attacking units, and the estimated date of execution. 1 decrypt was unambiguous. The landing sequence would begin with paratroopers from the 7th Air Division, dropping on Malem, Chania, Heraklion, and Rethymno simultaneously. Freyberg, a veteran of Gallipoli and the Somme, who had won his Victoria Cross leading attacks against prepared positions, continued to fortify his defenses along the coastline against a seaborne invasion that never came. The ultra-secret would not be declassified until the 1970s, which meant the first generation of official histories was written without this context, the uncomfortable truth that Freyberg had possessed detailed forewarning and responded to it inadequately. The men who died and were captured on Crete had been better informed than the history books initially admitted. It was a failure of imagination dressed up, for 3 decades, as a failure of intelligence. On the morning of the 20th of May at Rethymno, Campbell's preparations were as complete as 6 weeks of improvisation could make them. The Fallschirmjäger were coming. The first news of the day came not from Rethymno, but from the static crackling through whatever radio contact Campbell could maintain with Freyberg's headquarters. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the western sector erupted. German paratroopers and glider troops began landing around Malem airfield and the port of Chania. Reports filtering through to Campbell's position were fragmented and confusing, but the broad outline was clear. The invasion had begun, and the afternoon wave for Rethymno was coming. His men had been waiting in their positions since before dawn. They continued to wait. On the Greek mainland, the afternoon wave was encountering difficulties that Student's meticulous planning had not anticipated. The airfields from which the Rethymno assault force was to depart had been constructed hastily in the preceding weeks, and by the 20th of May, they were in a state of barely managed disorder. Hundreds of Junkers, Ju-52 transports, had been churning their unpaved surfaces into dust clouds that made taxiing and takeoff genuinely hazardous. Aircraft that had carried the morning assault were returning damaged, some needing repair before they could fly again. Several crash-landed on approach and had to be physically towed clear before the next wave could use the runway. Refueling was done not by Bowsers, but by hand, 50-gallon drums carried by men in the 40-degree heat, each aircraft requiring 24 drums. The paratroopers themselves stripped their combat equipment and joined the work parties in gym clothes, hauling fuel in temperatures that would have grounded operations in any air force that had planned with adequate resources. The assault had been scheduled to begin at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, preceded by a Luftwaffe airstrike to force the defenders underground and prevent them from observing the incoming transports. By the time the first aircraft was fueled and loaded, it was past 4. The support aircraft, operating on the original schedule, had departed at 2 and were already returning to base by the time the transports got airborne. They had suppressed nothing. They had forced no one to take cover. They had merely confirmed, in case the morning's reports from Malem had left any doubt, that this was the day. At 16 minutes past 4 in the afternoon of the 20th of May, 1941, the first German transports appeared over the north coast of Crete. They were flying parallel to the coastline, low and slow, as doctrine required. The Australians on Hills A and B watched them come. 160 Junkers, Ju-52 aircraft, flying at 400 feet, carrying the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 2nd Parachute Regiment and the headquarters company of Colonel Alfred Sturm. Not in the clean, simultaneous formation the plan had specified, but in ragged groups, the delays having scattered the timing into something closer to a procession than an assault. The anti-aircraft guns opened up on both hills. What happened next has been described in the reports of commanders, the letters of private soldiers, and the later testimony of men who spent decades trying to find words adequate to what their eyes had witnessed. Ralph Honner was a captain with C Company of the 2nd 11th Battalion, positioned under the trees east of Rethymno, with a clear view of the entire approach. He was a teacher who had studied law, a man accustomed to finding precise language for difficult realities. Looking up at the approaching fleet, at the small, dark shapes falling from the aircraft doors and the silk blooming behind them, he wrote afterwards that it was a spectacle that might have belonged to a war between the planets. Out of the unswerving flying fleet came tumbling lines of little dolls, sprouting silken mushrooms that stayed and steadied them, and lowered them in ordered ranks into consuming fire. And still they came, till all the fantastic sky before him was filled with futuristic snowflakes, floating beneath the low black thundercloud of the processional planes, occasionally flashing into fire as if struck by lightning from the earth. 7 transports were shot down outright, trailing fire and black smoke as they went. 9 crash-landed near Hill B, their cargoes spilling into terrain that the crews had been trying to avoid. At least 2 were last seen flying back toward Greece, with long plumes of smoke behind them, their paratroopers still aboard. Private James McKee, known to everyone in the 2nd 1st Battalion as Lofty, was manning a Bren gun on the slopes of Hill A when the transports turned inland. The men were coming down within 100 yards of his position, close enough to see their faces. He turned the weapon on them as they descended. They landed all around his position, right on top of it, some dropping into the alternative fighting positions the Australians had dug, and using them as cover. The crossfire from both hills and the ridge between them was so concentrated that, as McKee put it with the detached precision of a man describing something genuinely mundane, you simply could not miss. Lieutenant Noel Craig, commanding 13 Platoon of C Company, recalled the briefing Campbell had given before the battle, the instruction they had been given, and which they followed exactly. Hit them in the plains, hit them in the air, and if they reached the ground alive, kill them there too. Craig added, with the flat humor that Australian soldiers used as armor against everything the war asked of them, that he never went duck hunting again. The Fallschirmjäger who survived the descent found themselves in the worst version of the situation their doctrine had anticipated. They were on the ground, and they were alive, but they were armed only with a pistol and 4 grenades, and between them and their weapons containers stood Australians who had been waiting in prepared positions for 3 weeks. Some paratroopers were killed by the cane brakes on the western edge of the drop zone, impaled by bamboo before they touched the ground. Others drifted over the sea and drowned. Many were shot before they could disentangle themselves from their harnesses. The regimental headquarters section, nearly 200 men under Alfred Sturm himself, had been intended to land between the two assault battalions as a mobile reserve. The scattered drop placed them directly in the middle of the main Australian defensive position. The company was reduced within minutes of landing. Sturm managed to reach the ground, but by the morning of the 21st, he had been captured by soldiers of the Greek 4th Regiment and delivered to the headquarters of the 2nd 11th Battalion. The commanding colonel of the entire German assault on Rethymno, the man student had entrusted with the central prize of Operation Mercury, was now sitting in a farmyard under Australian guard. His regiment was fighting and dying on the hills outside the wire without him, and he had no means of communicating with them. They had no means of communicating with Student. In Athens, Student dispatched a liaison aircraft to establish contact with the 2nd Regiment. It failed to return. He sent a seaplane to land offshore and deliver a radio by rubber dinghy. The Australians on Hill B opened fire, sank the dinghy, and killed the crew. Rethymno remained, from the perspective of German command, a complete silence. It was not silence. It was a killing ground, and the men running it had 3 old telephones and a captured German codebook. To the west, in the town of Rethymno itself, the 3rd Battalion had landed in the wrong location and taken heavy casualties in the process. The survivors managed to regroup near the village of Perivolia and, at around 6 in the evening, marched toward the town expecting to find it open. What they found was 800 Greek gendarmes who had been waiting for them. The police cadets were not soldiers in any conventional sense. They had no training in infantry tactics and no particular protection under the laws of war if they chose to fight. They fired from windows and rooftops with pistols and rifles and shotguns. Cretan civilians joined them in the streets, men and women who had watched the sky fill with Germans that afternoon and made their own calculation about what kind of war this was going to be. Several Orthodox priests fired from behind church walls. A monk fought in the streets. The Germans, assaulting in the open against fire erupting from every building simultaneously, found themselves in a situation their training in Norway and Holland had not addressed. They retreated to Perivolia with significant casualties. The town of Rethymno had been defended by its own citizens. That success would eventually carry a price the people who achieved it could not yet see. But on that first evening, the line held. By the time darkness fell on the 20th of May, the situation at Rethymno bore no relationship to any version of Student's operational plan. The Australians held everything except Hill A, where Major Crow's surviving 1st Battalion men had consolidated after fierce close-quarters fighting. The German 3rd Battalion was pinned in Perivolia, unable to advance, cut off from Crow's force, and without radio communication with anyone. Sturm was in captivity. The regiment had lost more than 400 men, killed, wounded, or captured in a single afternoon, in the artillery positions on Hill A that the Germans had overrun. The gunners of the 2nd 3rd Field Regiment, who had survived, were reforming as improvised infantry in the darkness. They did not have enough rifles. Lou Lind remembered the solution they devised. Straws were drawn to select the man who would have the rifle. The rest armed themselves with shovels and pick handles. That was the Australian position on the evening of the 20th of May. One hill lost, one hill held, the town intact, the enemy commander a prisoner, and artillerymen armed with farm tools standing guard over their own guns in the dark. Campbell did not sleep. Before dawn on the 21st, he sent runners to coordinate a counterattack on Hill A using the 2nd 11th and the Greek 5th Regiment. The attack stepped off at 5:25 in the morning, moving forward in a single line at walking pace through vineyards toward the German positions above. It ran immediately into withering machine gun fire and red tracer cutting through the darkness at head height. The attacking line went to ground, then went back, retreating before sunrise with a dozen casualties. As the first light came up, the Germans on Hill A launched their own assault down the slopes toward the airfield. The attack was crisp and coordinated, a mortar barrage, then several assault groups working down the hillside under covering fire from MG-34 machine guns on the crest. An isolated Australian platoon that had lost contact with its company was overrun. The two Matilda tanks lurched forward into the rocky terrain and immediately bogged in the boulders, coming to a complete stop within 50 meters of their starting point. Campbell had positioned them as his armored counterattack reserve. They were now sitting immobile in the middle of the battlefield. Then a Ju-88 bomber, dispatched by Luftwaffe Command to support the German positions around Hill A, arrived over the objective unable to identify exactly where its own forces were. The radio silence that had consumed Sturm's regiment had a consequence no one had anticipated. The aircraft bombed the German positions on the hilltop by mistake. 16 paratroopers, men who had survived the descent through anti-aircraft fire and a night of close-quarters combat, were killed by their own air force. The Australians watching from the ridge, by several accounts, cheered. Campbell reassembled his forces and went to work. The telephone lines had been cut during the fighting. He sent runners with written orders to C Company and to his available reserves, directing them to a dried creek bed the men had named Wadi Bardia, carrying the name of a Libyan victory as a talisman across the Mediterranean. Then Campbell left his headquarters and moved alone toward the wadi, covering ground that had been open field 12 hours earlier and was now contested territory, dodging from rock to tree under sniper fire and occasional machine gun bursts from the hilltop above. He reached the wadi and found it occupied by a small group of wounded survivors from the airfield fighting. His reserves had not yet arrived. He waited for 30 minutes, alone in a dry creek bed with wounded men, while the battle continued around him. Soldiers began to filter in. When he had enough, he organized the assault. Captain Moriarty took C Company around the eastern flank and drove directly at the summit. 2 platoons reached the crest. Campbell personally led the mixed reserve force up the northwestern slope, moving through MG-34 fire that was cutting the air at waist height, the men following an officer who was moving toward the gunfire rather than away from it. The long Australian bayonets, the Gallipoli pattern that had been in service since the First War, went on at the base of the hill. When the Australians reached the German defenders at the top, the paratroopers who had held their position through a night of combat and a friendly airstrike and 2 failed counterattacks discovered something their pre-battle intelligence had not mentioned. That Australian soldiers in close quarters combat with bayonets fixed were a different category of experience than anything they had encountered on the European campaigns. The Germans retreated down the far slope in what witnesses described, without embellishment, as panic. Hill A was back in Australian hands. Campbell's men captured 69 prisoners, recovered both Matilda tanks, and retrieved the artillery pieces that had been abandoned the previous day. The hill that had been lost on the first day was now a German cemetery and an Australian strongpoint, and the men who had retaken it went back to their positions and cleaned their bayonets and waited for whatever came next. It was during the consolidation that Alfred Sturm was formally processed as a prisoner of war. He was separated from the enlisted men at his own insistence, in accordance with the convention, and Campbell complied. A German colonel and an Australian lieutenant colonel facing each other across the improvised formalities of a prisoner registration in a Cretan farmyard. Sturm had commanded the capture of the Corinth Canal the previous month, a textbook Fallschirmjäger operation, swift and decisive, Exactly what student had built the force to execute. Rethymno was the opposite of Corinth. We have no record of what Sturm said in that farmyard, or what he thought as he heard the sounds of his regiment fighting and dying outside the wire. Some moments the archive simply does not preserve. The codebook came into its full use the day after Sturm's capture. When Junkers Ju-52 aircraft flew over the Rethymno position on the 21st and 22nd of May, Sandover's radio operators used the captured signals procedures to transmit resupply requests in correct German format. The aircraft, receiving what appeared to be legitimate calls from their own forces on the ground, dropped their loads. Weapons, ammunition, equipment. The Australians collected them where they fell. The enemy was resupplying the men who were killing them, guided by the codebook recovered from an aircraft that a Bren gun crew had shot down against orders. It was the kind of audacious improvisation that becomes possible only when men have been in the field long enough to stop seeing rules and start seeing opportunities. The battle settled into a pattern that both sides recognized, and neither could break. The Germans held Paravolia in the west, and the ruins of an olive oil factory at Stavromenos in the east, solid stone structures that Campbell's mortars could harass but not reduce. The Australians held the two hills, the ridge, and the airfield itself. Campbell radioed Freiburg asking for reinforcements. Freiburg replied that none were available, that what he had was going toward the Malmö sector. The implication that something was going wrong 60 kilometers to the west filtered through to Rethymno without specific detail. Campbell noted it and continued managing the battle he was winning. The mortar exchange became the dominant reality of the days that followed. More than half of all casualties at Rethymno were caused not by rifle fire or bayonet charges, but by the arc of explosives through the Cretan sky, because the rocky hillsides provided almost no natural cover, and a man standing in the open was exposed to shrapnel from every direction when a round landed nearby. Both sides possessed mortars in quantity. The duel between them ran continuously, day and night. The thump of outgoing rounds answered seconds later by the crump of incoming ones. Private McKee, who had managed the Bren gun with such effect on the first day, was caught by this quieter war within the battle. Moving with Lieutenant Whittle and Private Chinnery toward the German positions on the 22nd, they were within 45 meters of the enemy when a round landed beside them. Fragments caught McKee in both legs. Chinnery's shoulder and neck were torn open. McKee dropped back to find a stretcher party, and while he was moving, a machine gun burst caught him in the back. He lay in a grove of trees for the rest of that morning, unable to move, listening to the fighting continue around him. Stretcher bearers eventually reached him. He would survive. On the 23rd of May, German paratroopers from the Paravolia position moved through the village of Mercury on the western edge of the battlefield. The civilians there, men, women, and children from the surrounding villages, had participated in the defense from the first day, fighting in the streets with whatever they possessed. Under the laws of war, as the Germans interpreted them, armed civilians were illegal combatants without protection. The paratroopers, frustrated by military failures their training had not equipped them to handle, assembled the people of Mercury and shot them. 110 names were eventually inscribed on the memorial built 40 years later. Those executions were the opening act of an occupation that would kill thousands and raze entire villages across the island. The price of resistance in Crete was paid in full, and it was paid by civilians. Campbell, coordinating the defense through his network of telephones and runners, knew the Germans were in Mercury. He did not yet know what they were doing there. The world beyond his immediate perimeter was becoming increasingly theoretical. What his patrols reported was consistent and, in isolation, encouraging. Captain Coombs of B Company recorded with the precision of a man keeping careful count that in every patrol clash, The Australians won. Not usually. Every time. The Fallschirmjäger who sortied from Perivolia to probe the Australian perimeter did not return. The men doing the patrolling had been in continuous contact with the enemy since before Bardia. They had learned things that could not be written into a field manual. They had learned the rhythm of the enemy, the sound his patrols made in the dark, the particular quality of silence that preceded an ambush, the difference between a German soldier who was confident and one who was afraid. By the 5th day, the Germans near Perivolia had stopped sending out patrols entirely. The Australians noticed this immediately. It was, in its way, the clearest possible signal that the battle was going exactly as it should. The smell of the battlefield had become, by that point, the dominant physical reality of the position. The Mediterranean heat in late May accelerates decomposition in ways that soldiers trained in temperate climates are not prepared for. The bodies swelled, and the ravens came, and the flies moved in clouds dense enough to cast shadows. The Australians who had fought in Libya had encountered a version of this before. The newer men had not, and the difference showed in their faces. By the 6th day, the veterans had stopped talking about it. By the 7th, nobody talked about it at all. The field hospital Campbell had established near the town of Adel had become the only neutral ground on the battlefield. Australian, British, Greek, and German medical personnel worked side by side, treating wounds from both sides of the wire. Medical supplies were critically short, and parachute silk was cut into strips for bandages. The German prisoners in the compound at Adel, more than 500 by this point, sat in the shade with no one formally guarding them, smoking cigarettes, waiting for an outcome that neither side could yet see clearly. By the 26th of May, Campbell's radio operator was receiving fragments of encrypted traffic from Freiburg's headquarters that made no coherent sense. References to movements and positions he had no context for. Orders that appeared to apply to a situation he could not identify. He could not decode the messages. He filed the fragments and continued managing the battle he was winning. What he could not know was that Freiburg had already told General Wavell in Cairo that the Battle of Crete was lost, that the evacuation order had been issued, and that ships were already moving toward the southern coast of the island. The men who had done more than any other force on Crete to deny the enemy, its objectives were fighting in an information vacuum, and the vacuum was about to become a trap. On the 26th of May, Campbell decided to end the stalemate at Stavromenos, once and for all. The olive oil factory had absorbed 3 separate Australian attacks in the preceding 5 days without yielding. Its stone walls were thick enough to take mortar rounds without structural failure, and its windows were narrow enough to provide firing positions without exposure. On the 26th, Campbell committed the 2nd 1st Battalion and the Greek 4th Regiment in a coordinated assault from multiple directions, covered by every mortar he could bring to bear simultaneously. The fighting inside the factory was close enough that the length of the bayonet was, by several accounts, more useful than the rifle it was attached to. The Germans who had held the position for 5 days, men who had jumped from Junkers aircraft into anti-aircraft fire and ended up defending a stone building from men who had been trying to kill them for a week, finally ran out of room. 100 prisoners were taken, 42 of them wounded. The 30 able-bodied survivors escaped eastward through the trees and were not seen again. The eastern stronghold had fallen. The tally at this moment would have made remarkable reading had anyone been keeping accurate count in real time. More than 500 German prisoners in Australian hands, the regimental commander among them, the airfield intact and under Australian control for 6 consecutive days. No ground yielded to the enemy since the recapture of Hill A on the 21st. By every standard by which such things are measured, Campbell had won. The morning of the 27th of May brought a problem of a different kind. A platoon of Honner's C Company was missing, last seen moving toward the German line at Paravolia, not returned. Whether the men were dead, captured, or stranded in no man's land was unknown. A rescue required covering fire from a position between the Australian Wadi and the German trench, 50 yards forward of the main line, 30 yards from the Germans themselves. Honor turned to Corporal Tom Willoughby. Willoughby was 23 years old, a Western Australian like most of the 2nd 11th Battalion, and he had been in the regiment since before Bardia. He was given the task of taking 8 men to a stone water cistern in the middle of the open ground, between the 2 lines, and mounting a Bren gun there. 9 soldiers, 9 men who had come to Crete by way of Libya and Greece, now being asked to walk into ground that both sides could see clearly, 30 yards from the German trench. There was no clever plan involved, no tactical sophistication, no technology that would give them an advantage. There was only open ground and the decision to cross it. On the signal, with the rest of the company providing covering fire from the Wadi, Willoughby rose and charged the stone well. What happened in the next several minutes at the Battle of Rethymno was not recorded in any formal citation and attracted no particular honor in the official record. It was one of 10,000 moments of the same kind in the same battle. 9 men doing what they had been asked to do, under conditions that eliminated all rational calculation and left only the decision itself. The platoon was recovered. The 9 men returned. That afternoon, Campbell's radio operator filed another set of fragments from Freiburg's headquarters that he could not decode. The messages continued to make no coherent sense. The island had already been decided, 60 kilometers to the west. At Malem, on the night of the 20th of May, while Storm was being processed as a prisoner at Rethymno, a single New Zealand battalion commander had made a decision that changed everything. Lieutenant Colonel Leslie Andrew, commanding the 22nd Battalion on the western edge of Malem airfield, lost radio contact with his companies on the far side of the perimeter. Interpreting the silence as evidence that they had been destroyed, he ordered a withdrawal. The companies he believed to be gone were, in fact, still fighting. They held their positions for several hours after their own headquarters had abandoned them, then discovered they had been left behind and withdrew in turn. By dawn on the 21st, the western edge of Malem airfield was undefended. German mountain troops began landing by midday. Within 48 hours, they had enough reinforcements to push east along the coast road with a strength that no available Allied force could resist. On the 26th of May, Freiburg reported to Wavell that the battle was lost. On the 27th, the evacuation was ordered. Campbell could not decode the message that told him to go south to the coast at Plakias. Freiburg would not send the order in clear text, because doing so might compromise the evacuation routes for the thousands of men still trying to reach the ships elsewhere on the island. The calculation was rational from the perspective of an overall commander balancing multiple forces. From the perspective of 900 men who had won every engagement they fought, it was the worst possible outcome, dressed up as operational security. On the morning of the 29th of May, the sound of motorcycle engines came in from the west, then tank treads, then artillery. The force arriving from the direction of Chania was not a parachute regiment improvising with pistols and grenades. These were men from the 5th Mountain Division, equipped with Panzer II and Panzer III tanks, light field artillery, and the mechanized capability of a formation that had been winning its way down the coast road for 3 days. Honor's company reported 3 tanks and a column of motorcyclists entering the valley behind the 2nd 11th's position. The geography of the situation had changed completely. The men who had been trapped and beaten for 9 days were gone. The army that had taken the rest of the island had arrived to collect what the paratroopers had been unable to take. Campbell assessed the situation without hesitation. His ammunition was effectively exhausted. The Greek regiments had withdrawn from their forward positions. The airfield was still held, still unconquered, exactly as ordered. But holding it further against tanks and artillery with empty magazines and no resupply would not alter the outcome. It would produce the massacre of men who had already done everything that had been asked of them. He ordered the surrender sometime after midday on the 29th of May, 1941. All German prisoners were released. The 500-plus Fallschirmjäger who had been in the compound at Adel walked out of the wire. Alfred Sturm walked out with them. He had spent 9 full days as an Australian prisoner of war. He had been present, under guard, for every day of the battle his regiment had fought without him. He had been treated with professional courtesy throughout. He would be awarded the Knight's Cross for his actions at Rethymno, a decoration for a battle he had spent as a prisoner. He would live until 1962 and leave no recorded public account of those 9 days. Whether he reflected on the men who had beaten his regiment so completely, or on the officer who had treated a captured enemy colonel with scrupulous correctness while destroying his command outside the wire, we cannot know. He never said. 934 Australians marched into German captivity. 190 were wounded. 96 had been killed in the fighting. Raymond Sandover did not order his battalion to surrender. He told his men they had a choice. Those who wished could lay down their weapons and walk toward the Germans. Those who wished otherwise could destroy their weapons and walk into the hills. Many of the West Australians chose the hills. The Cretan families who sheltered them in the months that followed were not professional resistance fighters. They were farmers and fishermen with children and homes and everything to lose. They knew what the Germans did to people who helped Allied soldiers. The evidence was 45 minutes walk away at Mercury. They hid the Australians anyway, for months, for nearly a year in some cases, at the constant risk of the reprisal that had already claimed their neighbors. 13 officers and 39 other ranks from the 2nd 11th Battalion eventually escaped to Egypt. 52 Australians from the Rethymno force in total reached safety. The island's people made that possible, at a cost that the island's people bore. The airfield at Rethymno was never used by German aircraft for the duration of the battle. 2 months after the fall of Crete, General Kurt Student was summoned to Hitler's headquarters at the Wolf's Lair. He had accomplished the impossible, seized an island from the air with no seaborne support, captured the last British foothold in the eastern Mediterranean, proven that the airborne doctrine he had spent a decade building could achieve its objectives. Hitler told him the day of the paratrooper was over. The casualty figures made the argument that Hitler would not dismiss. Approximately 4,000 Fallschirmjäger killed across the entire operation. Nearly 200 Junkers, Ju-52 transports destroyed or permanently put out of service. In percentage terms, Student had lost a greater proportion of his force in one operation than any German commander had lost anywhere since the war began. The specific report that Rethymno was not formally garrisoned, and the broader Abwehr assessment that 5,000 Allied troops held the island, had been wrong by a factor that went beyond intelligence failure into fundamental strategic misreading. The finest soldiers Germany had produced had been shot from the sky, bayoneted in the fields, and captured by police battalions and civilians with hunting rifles. Student understood the verdict. He stated it himself years later in the only honest assessment of Operation Mercury that any senior German commander committed to the record. Crete, he said, was the death of the airborne force. He was right, but only about his own side. For everyone else, it was the beginning. The officers who would build the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions studied the Battle of Crete with the focused attention of men reading both a warning and an instruction. The warning was about intelligence, about preparation, about the catastrophic cost of dropping trained soldiers into positions where waiting defenders had been told they were coming. The instruction was about what airborne assault could achieve when surprise was preserved, when the drop zones were chosen with care, when the tactical objectives were actually achievable. Student had failed because his intelligence had been disastrously wrong about who was waiting. If you knew what was waiting, if you chose your objectives accordingly, if you preserved the surprise that Student had squandered by attacking a garrisoned island in broad daylight, the potential was real. The Allies proved it. In the early hours of the 6th of June, 1944, American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions dropped into occupied France ahead of the Normandy landings. British paratroopers seized the Pegasus Bridge. German defenders, hearing the planes and finding their rear areas in chaos, could not determine where the main threat was or how to respond. The tactical disruption that Student had always promised, but failed to deliver at Crete, was achieved by men who had studied what not to do at Crete. Hitler had declared the day of the paratrooper over. The Allies used paratroopers to break the Atlantic Wall 3 years later. The German armed forces never launched another major airborne operation. The doctrine that had died in the rocky terrain above Rethymno and Heraklion was picked up from the ground by the people who had shot it down, refined into something that worked, and used to liberate Europe. Student was captured in 1945 and tried before a military tribunal in 1947 for the murder of prisoners of war and civilians in Norway and Crete. Found guilty on 3 of 8 charges, sentenced to 5 years, released after 1 year on medical grounds. Greek demands for extradition were refused. He lived until 1978, outliving almost everyone he had commanded and almost everyone he had ordered, killed. Justice, like the evacuation order to Campbell, never quite arrived. Both Australian battalions were reformed in Palestine around whatever cadres of surviving members could be assembled, the men who had escaped to Egypt carrying the institutional memory of what they had accomplished, while the 934 who had accomplished most of it were in German prison camps learning to wait. The official histories that would eventually be written about the Battle of Crete could not, for 3 decades, include the context that explained Freiberg's decisions, because the ultra-secret was not declassified until the 1970s. The first generation of readers understood that Crete had been lost. They did not understand that the losing had been preventable, or that the men who had come closest to preventing it had been the ones who were never told the battle was over. Ralph Honor, who had stood under the trees east of Rethymno and found the language to say what it looked like when the sky fell, did not go to a prison camp. He was among the small group of officers who evaded capture after the surrender and made their way to a Royal Navy submarine on the southern coast. He reached Egypt, was promoted, was decorated for his conduct in Greece, and rebuilt C Company around the nucleus of veterans who had escaped with him. He returned to Australia in May of 1942. The following August, he was commanding the 39th Battalion on the Kokoda Track in Papua New Guinea, holding the last defensible position between a Japanese force that outnumbered him 3-1 and the city of Port Moresby. He used what Crete had taught him, the principles he had learned on those hillsides, how to maintain cohesion when isolated from higher command, how to use terrain to multiply the effect of a small defending force against a larger attacking one, how to keep men fighting when the situation has been decided against them, were the principles that made the fighting withdrawal on the Kokoda Track possible. The battles in New Guinea are the most celebrated in Australian military history. They owe something, in ways not always acknowledged, to a morning in May on an Aegean island. The man who had once stood in an olive grove watching silken parachutes fall into his guns went on to hold a jungle track that stood between Japan and Australia, and the lessons were not so different. Hold your ground, Trust your men. Know the terrain better than the enemy does. Honor had learned all three of those things in the vineyards and rocky hillsides above Rethymno, and he carried them to every battle he fought afterwards. Ian Campbell came home from 4 years in German captivity and built things. He worked in construction. He served on the New South Wales Red Cross. He rose to Major General. He became Commandant of the Royal Military College Duntroon, the institution where, as a young man, he had won the Sword of Honor that began his career. He was still alive in 1997, 97 years old, and when he died, he was buried in the Presbyterian Cemetery at Bong Bong, near Moss Vale, where he had been born. The people of Crete sent an urn of soil from their island to be buried with him. Several streets in the town of Rethymno bear his name. A polished black granite pillar from South Australia stands in the Hellenic Australian Memorial Park on the northern coast of Crete, flanked by 2 limestone pillars representing Greek soldiers and Cretan civilians, all 3 the same height, standing beside each other the way the 3 communities had stood beside each other in May of 1941. At Mercury, 45 minutes from the battlefield, a marble column bearing 110 names stands where the executions were carried out. Some of the names are women. The memorial was erected in 1982, 41 years after the events it commemorates. A polished column of black granite and a marble column of names in a coastal town, standing in quiet testimony to things that the official narrative took decades to say plainly. Raymond Sandover died in 1995. The men from his battalion who had walked into the hills rather than into captivity, who had lived for months in the homes of Cretan families at the cost of those families' safety, never stopped talking about what those families had done. Most of them went back. Some of them sent their children. The connection between Western Australia and Crete that was forged in those 9 days in May of 1941 has outlasted everyone who fought in it, and is still kept alive by the people who came after. Here is what the history books call the Battle of Crete, an Allied defeat. The Germans took the island, the British evacuated or were captured, and Crete remained under Axis occupation until the end of the war. By the standard accounting of territory gained and territory lost, this is factually correct. It leaves almost everything out. The men of the 2nd, 1st, and 2nd 11th Battalions were never defeated in battle. They won every engagement they fought. They denied their airfield to the enemy for 9 consecutive days. They captured the enemy's commanding colonel on the 2nd morning and held him with professional correctness while destroying his regiment outside the wire. They used the enemy's own signals procedures to steal weapons from the enemy's own aircraft. They coordinated a defense that should have failed against superior numbers, with no air cover, no resupply, and no communication with higher command, and held it until the army that had taken the rest of the island arrived to collect what the paratroopers had been unable to take. They surrendered having completed their mission precisely as ordered. The paratroopers who dropped into France on the 6th of June, 1944, were not repeating a German lesson. They were completing an Australian one. Before, I asked you whether you had heard of the Battle of Rethymno. Now you understand why the question matters. The urn of Cretan soil in the cemetery at Moss Vale says what the official histories took 30 years to say, and what some of them still have not managed to say clearly enough. That a man from New South Wales and his men from New South Wales and Western Australia, fighting alongside Greek gendarmes and Cretan priests and civilians with shotguns, did something in 9 days in May of 1941 that changed the shape of the Second World War. They held what they were asked to hold. They took every prisoner they were sent. They never broke, never ran, never gave the enemy the ground it came to take. They just never got the credit for it. Now you know they deserve it.